Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Halper from ICAHD, speaking to you from Jerusalem for our April 2026 update. It's a very dramatic update, obviously, with all the wars in the region that is really going to change the Middle East landscape. Our point of view, of course, as critical Israelis and as people here really involved in the Palestinian struggle with our Palestinian comrades, you know, always are trying to see the logic behind what's happening in the region. And by far, if the United States might have been the biggest military might attacking Iran, but by far the logic, the reasoning, the goals behind this war in Iran and in the entire region has to do with Israel and the Palestinians and the whole process of normalizing, finally, the Zionist settler colonial enterprise. Israel has a very definite goal, and it has the military might and the diplomatic might, you might say, including now it's more and more of its alliances with the Arab world through the Abraham Accords, to, in a sense, set the agenda for the entire region. So you can't understand what's happening unless you understand what Israel's goals are and where we are in the struggle between Zionism and Palestinian resistance. Now, you've all heard me speak about settler colonialism. And this isn't simply some academic concept, settler colonialism. It really is the window through which we have to understand what's going on. And I just want to go over really briefly the settler colonial analysis, because unless we have this broader conceptual framework, unless we really understand how Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab world and Iran and so on fit into this, I think this process of settler colonialism, which is propelling everything, is very hard to understand what's going on in the region. Now, I'm not saying this is the only conflict or the only thing going on, obviously, but in many ways, because of the military might of Israel and the diplomatic might of Israel, it's maybe one of the overwhelming or preponderant processes that are happening that are reshaping the Middle East. And really, and we need that analysis, because settler colonialism, linked again to a very powerful Israel that has taken over Palestine, right? Has its logic, it has its narrative, it has its ideology, it has its goals, it has its structures and processes and policies and actions. You have to understand Zionist settler colonialism and Israeli policies today and how it's affecting the Palestinians and the wider region if you're going to understand what's happening in the region, especially these days, the war in Iran. So I've spoken about this many times. You can always go back and refer to earlier things I've said and written. But basically, there are three stages of settler colonialism. One is the whole point of it, the whole point of Zionism in the last 130 years has been to Judaize Palestine, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. And the other flip side, of course, of Judaization is de-Arabization, to de-Arabize Palestine. In other words, to come in, conquer the country, take the land, displace the Palestinian population, replace it with Jewish settlers, and then to, when you have that Judaization process in place, to normalize. Normalize is the end game. That's the third and final stage of settler colonialism. And we're in the middle of that process. That's the Abraham Accords. That's how settler colonialism wins. The way Israel will win, in a sense, is simply by normalizing. The Arab world and beyond, and the United States and the rest of the world will simply get to a point of saying, okay, good enough. Israel and its settlements remain. There's peace. We'll do some kind of a lip service apartheid thing for the Palestinians. So there's a kind of a two-state solution, and it's over. So that's really the immediate danger in front of us, is that these wars in Iran and Lebanon are moving us closer and closer to normalization. And Netanyahu has said this, that this is the purpose of these wars. And the Arab states have said, especially the Gulf states have said, as Iran attacks us, and as we see how vulnerable we are, it's pushing us towards Israel, really to normalize with Israel, because Israel is the military hegemon of the region. Without Israel, we're completely vulnerable, right? And so in a sense, the normalization process is happening, and this is the big context, I think, that we have to look at. And the problem with normalization is it's normalization. There's no political space for Palestinians afterwards. Whatever is signed, and Palestinians have nothing to do with this process. It's between states, between the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states, and maybe, Egypt, Jordan, some of the rest of the Arab world. That's it. The Palestinians are not at the table. There's no negotiations. There's no peace process. So basically, and that's why you're getting this tremendous ethnic cleansing of the violent settlers in the army in the West Bank today. Because whatever Israel can grab, until the day the Abraham Accords are finalized, Saudi Arabia comes into it, and we'll talk about this in a second. Maybe even Iran, Lebanon, and Syria come into them as well. Once that happens, there'll be, like I said, a tiny little Palestinian state, it might be called, because you needed two states. You can't ignore the Palestinians completely, but it'll be a normalization of a greater Israel. Israel plus all its settlements, with the Palestinians stuck into certain little tiny enclaves. And when the Palestinians then come and say, well, what about our rights? What about our struggle? The answer is going to be, sorry, we've normalized. We're moving on. There's Sudan, there's Ukraine, there's other crisis points in the world. And so normalization is the end of the settler colonial process, and it leaves very little political space for Palestinians, which is really why we have to be concerned about it. But a precondition to normalization is pacification. Israel has to break, and this is really the point of the update today, Israel has to break all resistance to its settler colonial process, Zionism taking over Palestine, not only Palestinian resistance, but any resistance regionally, which is what obviously brings in Iran. So there's circles of pacification going on today that are leading towards a normalization process. First of all, Gaza. The genocide in Gaza meant the breaking of the last bastion of effective resistance to Zionism, which was Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And we've seen the genocide in Gaza, that even though it raised all kinds of, Israel has problems with it in the ICC and the ICJ and criticism, in a way, it doesn't matter, because Israel feels that it doesn't matter, the criticism. The point is, are we being sanctioned? Do we have to pay any price, Israel says? And the answer is no. Look, it's done this in Gaza. We already have the Board of Peace run by Trump that hasn't done anything over the last 6, 7, 8 months. Gaza has kind of disappeared from the view. The Gazans are remained displaced, but the process of trying to transfer them to other countries is still going on. But the point is that Gaza was the breaking of the last major resistance to the Palestinians. That moved into the West Bank. The Israeli Ministry of Defense talks about the Gazification of the West Bank. And in fact, there were major military attacks in the refugee camps in the north, and now moving south to Bethlehem, Hebron, and other parts of the West Bank, together with the ethnic cleansing of the settlers. So at the same time, now inside Palestine, inside Greater Israel, as Israel would call it, or the land of Israel, you have the double processes of pacification happening and ethnic cleansing in order to create a state of industrial quiet that then we can go on to normalization. That's inside, and this is, if you talk about a two-state solution, this is a map put out by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. In other words, Israel's concept today of what will happen is Israel on 90% of Palestine, and the Palestinians, of course, the refugees will never come back, but the 6 million Palestinians still living in Palestine will be confined to these to one, two, three, four, five, six little islands, and a couple little islands inside Israel as well, on maybe 8 to 10% of their land. So it's super apartheid. But this is what Israel believes. It might be cosmetically widened to 10%, 12%. The point is, where Israel is going is towards normalization of a greater Israel and locking the Palestinians into these little enclaves. Um, and and it's not even a two-state solution because Israel will not allow, or at least that's its position now, a Palestinian state, even on these tiny little enclaves, because that gives it membership in the UN, a little bit too much clout. So Israel's idea is two-state apartheid. In other words, a Palestinian autonomous entity and not even a state within these little kinds of enclaves. So that's the first circle of pacification going on, pacifying the Palestinians, breaking their resistance, and then creating that quiet where the Arab world can then move on to normalization. Now, settler colonialism is very violent, of course, because genocide is built into it. You can't take over someone's country without genocide. The other side of settler colonialism and Judaization and so on is resistance, Palestinian resistance. That it's been very effective, actually, over these years, even though Israel, for all kinds of reasons we won't have to get into, has tremendous military and no less important diplomatic power, with, of course, Europe, but especially always the United States behind it, which has given it tremendous advantage. Nonetheless, the Palestinian resistance has prevented Israel from finishing its settler colonial project. Nonetheless, there's a lot of support for Palestinians regionally among the Arab peoples, and not only the Arab peoples, of course, the Muslim peoples, Turkey, Iran, further abroad. The Muslim and Arab peoples very much support the Palestinians as opposed to their governments that are very much transactional and are very attracted to Israel because of its military and political strength. And so in order to, again, to create this second circle of pacification, of industrial quiet, Israel also has to break the resistance outside of Palestine itself, in the region. And that means especially Iran. Iran has been the state, the only state really, that has really supported the Palestinians militarily, financially, politically, and other ways. And that is why it's the great target of Israel. But not only that, Iran is also the only real challenger to Israeli military hegemony in the region. We're beginning to get in this whole Middle Eastern region a kind of division of labor where the Gulf states, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, are becoming the economic hegemons, and Israel is very clearly becoming the military hegemon, which is what, of course, progresses this whole process of normalization. So the dual purpose of the Iran war, from Netanyahu's point of view, from Israel's point of view, is, first of all, to break this support for the Palestinians, and second of all, to eliminate Iran as a rival for military hegemony in the region. And so we have the attack on Iran, but not only that, of course, you can see in the northern part here above the northern part of Israel, this part of southern Lebanon up to the Litani, that Israel is threatening to occupy permanently. It's occupied, this whole part of Lebanon, because Hezbollah is also not only a military, not really a threat, but a military annoyance, but it's also a part of this resistance. The point is not so much that it's a real military threat to Israel, but it keeps the resistance alive. And as long as, again, that resistance is alive, you can't get on to normalization. That's why breaking breaking Hezbollah is so important. And then you've got Syria. Now, Syria is desperately trying to normalize relations with the rest of the world, including the United States. It's gotten sanctions removed. It's trying to bring the country together to a certain degree. And Israel, of course, has been occupying the Golan Heights in Syria since 1967. But since the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, as you can see with this little yellow line to the north here in Syria, Israel's actually occupied additional territory in Syria. Now, what does this all mean? Again, keep normalization in the foreground. It means that Israel then has quieted Palestinian resistance, making it possible for the Sunni Arab states to either join the Abraham Accords or associate with them, if not actually join them. De facto normalization is fine. And so you've got Syria that de facto is doing that. It's normalizing relations with Israel. It's becoming what's called Israel-friendly without declarations. But basically, Syria has come into the sphere of the Abraham Accords. What about Lebanon? Well, Lebanon today, or yesterday today, of course, the announcement was made that Israel and Lebanon are going into peace talks, the main point being disarming Hezbollah, right? And so Lebanon would have no problem whatsoever with normalizing with Israel. And this, I think, again, is going to be so now Lebanon is coming in. What about Iran? Well, if the Iranian regime wants at some point to stabilize its relations with the rest of the world, including the United States, and get back to some sort of normalcy, it's whether or not it's the same regime or another regime, the condition is, and here's where I think the United States comes in, the condition is it has to be Israel friendly. It's not going to join the Abraham Accords. It can continue its rhetoric, of course, against Israel and Zionism, but basically it has to give up the idea of attacking Israel or destroying Israel, that it said. So again, de facto, Iran is going to be brought into this realm of the Abraham Accords. That's the second sphere. And Netanyahu is very upfront about it. You know, he says that normalization is the goal. And he's in the UN. Here's a picture of him in the UN, showing the map of the new Middle East, where you can see there's an entire greater Israel. There is no Palestine on his map. In this Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, because this was just before the October 7th attacks when he was in the UN, and Saudi Arabia was just posed to join the Abraham Accords. I think that's part of the timing of Hamas. The attack on October 7th actually very effectively stopped the normalization process because I think Hamas and the Palestinians understood the threat that it posed to their struggle. But at any rate, you could see this is Netanyahu's vision, plan that's very upfront. But there's a third circle of normalization, and that's the entire region and beyond the region. Israel, since the 50s, has had a policy called alliances with the periphery. The idea being to encircle the Arab world that was hostile at that time, encircle it with all kinds of minorities that would allow it to really work and kind of encompass, almost trap the entire Arab world. You had the Turks, you had the Iranians in the time of the Shah, you had the Kurds, you had the Ethiopians, you had the Christians in Lebanon that Israel went into the 1982 war as allies of. You had the Copts in Egypt. In other words, all kinds of minorities that would help press Israeli interests abroad. Now we fill that in because the whole Arab center has agreed to normalize with Israel. So you can see here, the darker green are countries that already have relations with Israel. from Morocco through Turkey, through Azerbaijan, where Israel actually has a military base, where it sends its space satellites, its spy satellites into space, Turkmenistan, and so on. And now the countries that joined the Abraham Accords, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, on the cusp, Jordan, Egypt, and so on. Sudan, Morocco are all in the Abraham Accords. Israel has just established diplomatic relations with Somaliland, which is pretty strategic. And Israel has always had, of course, close contacts with Ethiopia, and it has another military base. Israel basically has two military bases abroad, both in Muslim countries, one in Azerbaijan, the other one in Eritrea. So you can see how it's beginning to come together for Israel. And finally, the beige and the dark, Lebanon now will, is likely to fall into this sphere. And like I said, Iran as well in one way or another, and Pakistan, which has long sought alliances with Israel and is actually the mediator today in this Iranian war. So you can begin to see how normalization is actually happening. And again, this, in my view, is the greatest threat to the Palestinians since the Nakba in 1948. And this has to be focused. But you see, we're lacking that analysis. That's why that analysis is so important, because you don't get to the idea even, not only the importance of normalization, unless you understand the process of Zionist settler colonialism and where it's going. And lacking that, we're really lacking an effective, not only analysis, but the analysis leads to action, to campaigns. And we're lacking, if you go to rallies in London or New York or Washington or anywhere in the world that are really great, rallies for Palestine, do you ever hear the word normalization? Of all the campaigns all our groups are pursuing, is there any campaign against normalizing Israeli apartheid? Which, from this analysis, from my point of view, is the most important campaign of all. And so that's why this analysis and where it leads us strategically is really so important. So let me end by saying, in my view, there are 6 tasks before us today to confront this threat of normalization, and actually to work with the Palestinians towards the success of their liberation struggle. First of all, we have to stop the settlement process. New settlements are being established every week in the West Bank by the Israeli government. Stop the settlement process itself, not only protest settler violence, but the whole process of the settlement enterprise that continues, the Judaization of Palestine, the settlement of Palestine, including, of course, the corporate colonization of Gaza. We're not hearing much about Gaza anymore, but the Gazans are in danger of being transferred out or becoming a service population in a Jared Kushner tourist resort kind of an enterprise. So that this is the first task. The second task, maybe the most immediate and urgent, again, is to stop normalization and to keep the Palestinians at the center of everything, not to allow any kind of normalization discussion to go on only among states, but to ensure that the Palestinians remain at the center, and normalization cannot happen until Palestinian rights are guaranteed. Third, we have to make Zionism unsustainable, just like the ANC made the apartheid regime in South Africa unsustainable. That's BDS does a lot of that and so on. But really what we're lacking, in my view, is a political program. And this is the Palestinians' responsibility, especially to put forward, because it's their struggle. They have to be the ones that tell us what their program is. But today we're lacking a program. We know the two-state isn't working. There's beginning to be talk of one state. And in fact, an organization that I'm part of, the One Democratic State Campaign, has formulated a 10-point detailed one state, one democratic state proposal. So this is where you go, and it makes sense in terms of settler colonialism, because it's a form of colonialism. And the only way you end colonialism is by decolonization. You don't end it by negotiations. Israel has no intent and never had an intent of negotiating with Palestinians. It doesn't even recognize the existence of Palestinians and their rights. And settler colonialism has a clear goal. It wants all. Zionism wants all of Palestine, not 70%, not it wants it all. And if it can't get rid of the Palestinians, in that 8, 9, 10% to lock them into these little islands. And so we need a political program in order to give us a vision and a direction of where we're going. So if we say to the world, Zionism cannot continue, we have to end it, the world wants to know, okay, that's fine with us, but where are we going with it? What does it mean for the Israeli Jews? What does it mean? In other words, you have to give people somewhere to go if you're going to make Zionism unsustainable. Fourth, again, you have to decolonize Palestine, dismantle all the structures of domination and control that Zionism has imposed over the country. Fifth, then the Palestinians, within their political program, have to be sure that whatever political resolution follows, and I would hope it would be one democratic state, that it addresses their liberation goals. In other words, there has to, whatever political resolution comes about has to be built around the needs of the Palestinians, their rights, and their liberation goals. And finally, then, together, all the people living between the river and the sea, including refugees who come back, will then together construct a post-colonial state and an inclusive civil society. So as opposed to this normalization process that's happening today before our eyes, we have to really be sure that the Palestinian struggle is before our eyes, that we're strategic, and that the Palestinians don't disappear, in the shuffle between the wars in Iran and the Abraham Accords and everything else going on. I'll leave it at that and see what happens in our May update. Bye.